An elderly black man, sitting alone on a park bench, just enjoying the afternoon. But then a white officer approaches. No crime, no complaint, just a man with the wrong skin color. What happens next exposes a lifetime of quiet dignity, a city's buried racism, and one secret that silences everyone. When they learn who he really is, it's already too late. The sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Middleton, its golden rays gently touching the cracked sidewalks and freshly watered lawns. Morning joggers passed by slowly. Coffee shops buzzed faintly with the sound of espresso machines, and across the street from a sleepy convenience store, an elderly black man named Mr. Elijah Carter sat peacefully on a worn wooden bench. Elijah was a retired schoolteacher, a grandfather, and a man who had seen much of the world in his 76 years. His beard was gray, trimmed, and neat, his brown eyes steady behind a pair of wireframe glasses. He wore a pressed brown cardigan, tan slacks, and polished shoes, the sort of man who still dressed properly, even just to grab a newspaper. He had a gentle presence, the kind that made people feel at ease. That is, when people saw him for who he was. That morning, he was waiting outside the store for it to open. The owner, Mr. Garza, knew him well. Elijah came every Thursday for the latest paper and a bag of cinnamon candies. But this morning, before Mr. Garza could unlock the doors, a patrol car pulled up to the curb. Officer Brandon Kyle stepped out. He was young, maybe early 30s, with pale skin, short blonde hair, mirrored sunglasses, and a visible chip on his shoulder. A man who looked like he had something to prove. His badge glinted in the sun as he approached Elijah. "Hey!" the officer called out sharply, startling Elijah mid-sip of coffee. "You loitering here?" Elijah looked up, confused but polite. "Morning, officer. Just waiting for the store to open. Mr. Garza usually gets here around 8. Officer Kyle didn't respond with a greeting. He took a step closer, hand resting near his holster. "Got any ID on you?" Elijah blinked. "I do, yes. But is there a problem?" Kyle's lips tightened. "You're sitting in front of a store before it opens. That's suspicious. Some businesses have been vandalized lately. Just doing my job." Elijah reached calmly into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. "I understand. Here you go." But Kyle snatched the wallet from his hand, flipping it open aggressively. "Elijah Carter. Local address." "Ha!" Like I said, Elijah replied, maintaining his composure. "Just waiting for my Thursday paper." Kyle tossed the wallet back into Elijah's lap. "You live in this neighborhood?" 34 years, Elijah answered. "Used to teach over at Roosevelt High." The officer didn't seem to care. His eyes were already scanning Elijah's appearance. An old man, alone, black, sitting on a bench in what he considered a nicer part of town. In his mind, Elijah didn't belong. Not unless he was cleaning something or holding a name tag. Then came the radio buzz. "Unit 3, we've got a code 32, minor disturbance on 8th and Maple." Kyle clicked his shoulder mic. "Copy. I'll check it out after this suspicious individual is cleared." Suspicious individual. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Officer, I'm not sure why this has escalated." Kyle stepped closer. "Now, you don't get to decide that." He leaned in just slightly. "Why don't you stand up, sir?" Elijah sighed and slowly rose. His knees ached, and he used his cane, a polished wooden stick with a brass handle, for balance. "Turn around." "For what?" Elijah asked, his voice still calm. "I said turn around." There was a moment, one of those moments where time seems to hang like a tightrope, and then Elijah complied, slowly, as Kyle pulled out a pair of cuffs. Just then, a voice called out from across the street. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" It was Mr. Garza, hurrying over, keys still in hand. "That's Mr. Carter. He's my customer. Man. Every week, for years." Kyle hesitated. He's just sitting there. He ain't done anything. Garza continued, stepping between the two men. Are you serious right now? Kyle's jaw tightened. Mind your business, sir. This is my business. That's my store. And this man is a good man. Elijah stood quietly, the cuffs still dangling from one wrist. His expression hadn't changed. Not anger, not fear. Just quiet, weary disappointment. Kyle finally stepped back, muttering something about staying alert. Fine, but I'm keeping an eye on things. He turned and walked back to his cruiser, slamming the door. Mr. Garza shook his head. I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter. This is ridiculous. It's all right, son, Elijah replied softly. Unfortunately, I've been here before. As the officer drove away, Elijah took a slow breath and sat back down. Though his hands trembled slightly now, Mr. Garza unlocked the store and went inside, still muttering angrily. A young woman across the street had filmed the entire thing. By noon, the video had gone viral. A caption read, "Racist cop harasses old black man, just waiting for his morning paper." People started sharing the video, tagging the local police department. Comments poured in. He's somebody's granddad. This man could have had a heart attack. Why does this keep happening? Elijah's phone rang later that day. His daughter, then his son, then his church pastor. He tried to laugh it off, told them it was just another day in America. But inside, a sadness lingered, because it didn't matter that he'd been a teacher for decades, that he was a father, a grandfather, a husband, a neighbor. To Officer Kyle, he was just another black man on a bench, just another problem. But what the officer didn't know, what the world was about to learn, was who Elijah Carter really was. And when they found out, regret wouldn't be strong enough of a word. The video of Officer Kyle harassing Elijah Carter rippled across social media like wildfire. Within hours, it was featured on multiple news outlets' local segments. The headline on one major post read, "Retired black educator harassed by police, was just waiting for his morning paper." The footage, barely 90 seconds long, carried the weight of centuries. People weren't just watching what happened. They were reliving the countless instances of injustice, disrespect, and racism that elderly black Americans had endured in silence for decades. But behind the viral momentum was a man who had never asked for attention. Elijah Carter had lived quietly for most of his life. He had raised a family, taught history for 40 years, buried his wife 3 years prior, and spent most mornings with a newspaper and a black coffee. But now, as his name trended online, Elijah felt like a spotlight was forced on him he didn't want. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing number of messages. Former students, neighbors, strangers, all reaching out. One former student, now a journalist named Nicole Benton, had seen the video and instantly recognized her old teacher. "Mr. Carter," she wrote in an emotional Facebook post, "you taught me to hold my head high even when the world tried to push it down. I'll never forget you. You didn't deserve this." That same day, the local chapter of the NAACP reached out, offering support. A civil rights attorney contacted Elijah's son. And then came the most unexpected call of all from Congressman David Whitmore. Whitmore had been mentored by Elijah years ago when he was a young, angry student. Now, he was one of the most respected black leaders in the state. "Sir," Whitmore said during their call, "I owe everything I am to you. If you're willing, I'd like to speak up publicly about what happened." Elijah sighed. "David, I don't want attention. I just want to live my life." "I understand, Mr. Carter, but you've lived a life worth sharing, and the world needs to remember who you are." Meanwhile, Officer Brandon Kyle sat stiffly in the chief's office at the Middleton Police Department. The room was tense. The police chief, a hardened woman named Sandra Reed, didn't mince words. Do you have any idea who the man in that video is? She snapped, slamming a manila folder on her desk. Kyle shrugged. Some guy loitering outside a store. Some guy, she repeated incredulously. She opened the folder and pulled out a document, a full bio. Elijah Benjamin Carter, decorated war veteran, Bronze Star, retired history teacher, community mentor, founder of the local youth literacy initiative. He taught half this town, including my brother. You harassed an icon, Brandon. Kyle's face reddened. He looked suspicious. No, she snapped, standing. He looked black and old. And you didn't bother asking questions. There was silence. We're facing public outrage. Brandon, that video makes you and this entire department look like racists with badges. Kyle shifted uncomfortably. So what happens now? You're suspended pending review. Internal affairs will handle the rest. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look on her face silenced him. It was over. Back at Elijah's modest home, his living room was filled with flowers, letters, and boxes of cinnamon candies. His favorite. People he hadn't spoken to in years were showing up at his door, with homemade pies and tears in their eyes. His daughter, Janine, a nurse, had taken off work to stay with him. You doing okay, Daddy? She asked as she massaged his aching shoulders. Elijah gave a soft chuckle. Been a while since the world paid attention to an old man like me. An old man who made history, she said, kissing his cheek. Elijah stared at the television, where a reporter stood outside the police station talking about public protests that were scheduled for the weekend. But all he could think about was how none of this would have happened if Officer Kyle had just said good morning instead of reaching for his cuffs. People want to hear your voice. Janine said gently, you don't have to speak up, but maybe it's time. He nodded slowly, his fingers resting on his cane. Maybe so. That evening, Elijah agreed to do a sit-down interview with Nicole Benton, his former student turned journalist. The two met at his dining room table, the same one where he used to grade essays and help his grandkids with their homework. Nicole set up the small camera. Just speak from your heart, Mr. Carter, she said softly. And he did. In a calm, steady voice, Elijah spoke about the morning on the bench, about the officer who treated him like a threat, about the pain of feeling invisible in a country he had served and contributed to. I'm not angry, Elijah said, looking directly into the camera. I'm tired of being followed in stores, tired of being questioned for existing, tired of people seeing my skin before they see my name. He paused. But I also believe in better. I believe that we raise sons and daughters who do better, that one day an old black man can sit on a bench and be seen as what he is, a neighbor, a father, a friend. Nicole wiped tears from her eyes as she ended the recording. The interview was posted that night. It exploded online. The video was shared by celebrities, activists, even the governor. In less than 24 hours, it reached over 10 million views. Elijah's calm voice, his dignity, his quiet sadness, it struck a chord with the world. By the weekend, Middleton's town square was filled with hundreds of peaceful protesters. Signs read, "We are all Elijah. Being black shouldn't be a crime. Honor our elders. Don't harass them." And at the center of it all, sitting quietly in a lawn chair, was Elijah Carter, dressed in his Sunday best, cane in hand, with his children and grandchildren standing proudly beside him. He hadn't planned to become a symbol, but maybe, just maybe, it was time, because names like his deserved to be remembered, and stories like his deserved to be told. The Monday following the protest, the small town of Middleton felt different. Where once quiet complacency ruled, now every corner echoed with conversation. In cafes, schools, and city buses, people were talking not just about Elijah Carter's story, but about what it revealed about the world they lived in. Yet inside Elijah's home, things remained as simple and grounded as always. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee, his back straight, as always. Military habits never quite left a man. Janine was at the stove, flipping pancakes for her kids who had stayed the night after the protest. Elijah's youngest granddaughter, Maya, sat next to him, drawing a picture of him on the park bench, with hearts floating around it. "You made the news, Grandpa," she said, not quite understanding the full weight of it. "You're like a superhero now." Elijah chuckled, ruffling her hair. Superheroes usually don't have bad knees. But even as his family returned to normal routines, things in the outside world were still shifting rapidly. Officer Kyle's suspension had become indefinite, and the Middleton Police Department had launched a full internal review, not just of the incident, but of other complaints and past behavior. Several other residents had come forward anonymously, detailing minor but telling encounters with Kyle, all sharing the same theme: racial profiling and disrespect. Meanwhile, national media had descended on Middleton, some looking to tell Elijah's story, others seeking scandal or sound bites. But Elijah politely turned them all down. All except one. A call came in from Professor Simone Wallace, a respected Black historian and civil rights researcher who had been compiling a digital archive of overlooked local Black leaders across the country. She had watched Elijah's interview and felt something deeper, a sense that there was more to his story. "Mr. Carter," she said, when they finally spoke on the phone, "I think you're more than just a beloved teacher. You're part of our living history, and I'd like to help document your life." Elijah hesitated. "I'm not sure there's much to say that hasn't been said." But Simone gently persisted. "You served in Korea and Vietnam. You founded the first free tutoring center for Black kids in the 80s. You helped integrate our school system here. Sir, you are living proof of a fight many don't even know existed." Elijah agreed to meet her the next week. On the other side of town, Officer Kyle sat in a small meeting room at the department headquarters, dressed in plain clothes, facing an investigator from Internal Affairs. "Let's go over your report again," the investigator said. Kyle's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I saw a man sitting outside the store. He wasn't doing anything, but he looked suspicious," the investigator finished for him. Kyle nodded. "Because he was Black." Kyle didn't respond. "You ever stop to wonder if you would have approached a white man the same way? No conversation, just aggression?" Kyle stared at the table. "This isn't the first complaint filed against you, officer, but it's the first time the whole country saw it happen in real time." Kyle finally looked up. "I didn't mean for it to go that way. I thought." "You didn't think at all," the investigator cut in. "And now the department's integrity is in question. You've made yourself a liability. That means something in this job." He sighed, his badge placed neatly in a plastic bag beside him. For now, symbolic of everything he'd lost. Meanwhile, at the local library auditorium, Elijah met with Professor Wallace. She had traveled with a small team of researchers and cameras to record a video oral history of his life. They began with childhood, growing up in the segregated South, going to an all-Black school where books were passed down after white students discarded them. "I still remember the pages being torn," Elijah said quietly, "but I read them anyway. I didn't need perfect books to learn. I just needed the chance." They moved through his early adulthood, how he was drafted, how he served with dignity and honor despite the racism he endured in his own ranks. She pulled out a photograph of a young Elijah in uniform, smiling despite the weight of a war behind his eyes. "You ever talk about this part of your life?" Simone asked. Elijah shook his head. "Most people didn't care, and I didn't need the praise, just peace. But now the world cared, And Simone wanted to make sure his story wouldn't be forgotten. Not again, not like so many others. After the interview, Elijah's granddaughter Maya asked to see his medals. He took down the old wooden case from the closet where it had gathered dust for years. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, unit citations, letters from generals. Maya's eyes widened. "You were really a hero," she whispered. Elijah looked at her tenderly. "No, I just did what was right, even when no one was watching." Word of Elijah's story being documented began to circulate again. And this time, it didn't just catch fire with media. Universities began reaching out, offering honorary doctorates. The mayor's office announced plans to rename the local park in his honor. And the community started pushing to establish an annual Elijah Carter Day to honor Black veterans and educators. Despite the attention, Elijah stayed humble. But deep inside, he was feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, not satisfaction, but something simpler, validation. He was seen, finally, for who he truly was. And that meant more than any apology. At Officer Kyle's disciplinary hearing, things came to a head. His union lawyer made a half-hearted attempt to frame the event as a misunderstanding. But the panel, which included 3 civilians and 2 senior officers, was unmoved. "We can't undo what was done," the chairwoman said, "but we can choose whether or not to let it happen again." Kyle's police certification was revoked. He left the department, jobless and disgraced. As he walked out of the station for the last time, reporters surrounded him. He didn't speak. There were no excuses left to give. That evening, Elijah sat in the park, the same bench he had once been harassed on. But now, a small bronze plaque rested beside it. "In honor of Elijah Carter, veteran, teacher, beloved neighbor." People passed by and nodded, many stopping to thank him, share stories, or simply sit beside him for a moment of peace. And as the sun dipped low, Elijah closed his eyes and let the warmth hit his face. For once, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, not weariness, but something as rare as it was powerful: peace. A few weeks had passed since Elijah Carter's name had become known across Middleton and beyond. The initial media frenzy had calmed, but the story still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, not forgotten, just smoldering quietly in the minds of the townspeople. Elijah had never wanted attention, and yet it seemed the attention refused to leave him alone. Every day, someone dropped by his home, a young student thanking him for paving the way, a former colleague from the school who had seen his courage long ago, or even an elderly neighbor who just wanted to say, "I'm sorry for never speaking up before." The town was changing, slowly, uncomfortably, but it was changing. At City Hall, a new initiative had been launched in Elijah's name, the Carter Community Reform Program. It focused on police accountability, training on racial bias, and supporting veterans in marginalized communities. The mayor, once quiet and politically careful, now publicly advocated for reform, admitting if it weren't for Mr. Carter's story, we would still be blind to our failures. And then came the letter. It arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Elijah had been sitting in his garden, clipping away dead stems from his tomato plants, when Janine walked out with the envelope. "It's from Kyle," she said simply, handing it to him. Elijah took it slowly. The name on the return address confirmed it: Kyle Branson. No rank, no badge. Just a name. He sat down on the porch and unfolded the letter. "Mr. Carter, I don't know where to begin. I don't even know if I deserve to speak to you after the way I treated you. But I have to try. I grew up thinking I understood the world. I believed my uniform gave me purpose, that the law would always guide me to make the right choices. I now realize I was wrong. The day I approached you, I wasn't acting as a protector. I acted out of ignorance, fear, and prejudice. I saw you sitting there, a man with dignity and calm. And I treated you like a threat, not because you were doing anything wrong, but because you looked like someone I had been trained quietly over years to fear. When I found out who you really were, I was ashamed. I read your history. I watched the community rally behind you. I watched how you never once responded with hate, even though I gave you every reason to. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I see it now. I see you, and I see how blind I've been. Since my dismissal, I've started attending therapy and racial bias workshops. I'm working with a community outreach program in a nearby town, not because I think it will fix what I did, but because I need to start being useful in a way that matters. If you're ever willing, I would like to apologize to you in person. Respectfully, Kyle Branson. Elijah sat in silence, reading the letter twice, then a third time. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply folded the paper and placed it on the table. Are you going to meet him? Janine asked gently. I don't know, he said, his voice low. She sat beside him and squeezed his hand. Whatever you decide is the right decision. But Elijah did not rush. He went about his days slowly, processing everything. He tended his garden, read to Maya each evening, and kept himself surrounded by the community that finally saw him, truly saw him, for the first time in decades. And then one morning, Elijah made a quiet call to the community center where Kyle had started volunteering. The meeting was arranged. They met at a small, neutral cafe on the edge of Middleton, one without cameras, crowds, or political eyes watching. Just two men, sitting across from each other. Kyle looked different, not just physically, though the uniform was gone, replaced by a plain blue shirt and jeans, but emotionally, he looked smaller, humbled, a man who had been cracked open from the inside. Mr. Carter, he said softly, standing as Elijah approached. Elijah nodded, motioning for him to sit. No handshake. Not yet. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Elijah broke the silence. You wrote me a letter. Kyle nodded. Yes, sir. I meant every word. Elijah studied him, eyes sharp. Do you know how many men like you I've met in my life? Kyle swallowed hard. Too many, I imagine. Elijah leaned forward. And how many do you think apologized? Kyle didn't answer. You're the first, Elijah said. I've been pushed, insulted, threatened, and dismissed. I was spit on in uniform. I was ignored in classrooms. I was overlooked in council meetings. And never once did anyone who did it come back and say they were wrong. Kyle's eyes welled slightly. He tried to hold it back. I'm not here to make you feel better. Elijah continued. And I'm not here to give you peace. That's not mine to give. Kyle nodded. I understand. But I will say this, Elijah said, voice steady. Owning up to it, that matters. It won't erase it, but it matters. What you do next, how you live now, that's the apology I'll be watching. A long pause stretched between them. Then, slowly, Elijah stood. Kyle stood, too. And this time, Elijah extended his hand. Kyle grasped it, not tightly, not in triumph, but in quiet recognition. News of the meeting stayed private. Elijah never told the press. Kyle never spoke about it to anyone but his mentor. But the ripple it created was felt in ways that couldn't be measured. In the following months, Kyle continued his work with at-risk youth. He became involved in reform initiatives, sometimes in the background, sometimes quietly passing on what he had learned through failure. And though his name had once been a symbol of prejudice, now it became part of a larger lesson. That growth was possible, but only through discomfort, humility, and truth. Elijah, meanwhile, was asked to speak at several colleges. His voice, once confined to dusty classrooms and front porches, now filled auditoriums where students leaned forward to listen, not because he was a viral story, but because he was living history. He ended every speech with the same words. Don't wait until it's on camera. Do the right thing even when no one's watching. That's where real justice begins. Elijah Carter, once harassed for sitting quietly on a bench, had become a bridge between generations, between communities, and between what America was and what it still hoped to become. But through it all, he remained who he'd always been. A man of principle, a man of peace, a man who taught the world, not with shouting, but with stillness and strength. Years passed, the headlines faded, the protests quieted, and the media cycle moved on. But in Middleton, the story of Elijah Carter became more than just a moment. It became a movement. Elijah never asked for that. He never wanted fame or speeches or recognition. All he ever wanted was a world where his grandchildren didn't have to keep explaining their worth. A world where men in uniforms saw his skin and didn't instantly assign it fear. A world where sitting peacefully on a park bench didn't carry risk or suspicion. But because the world hadn't yet become that place, Elijah chose to stand. And somehow, by simply standing, he changed everything. One of the most visible reminders of that change stood right in the heart of downtown Middleton, Carter Square. What used to be a forgotten lot, overgrown and overlooked, was now a peaceful space filled with benches, community murals, and a bronze statue of Elijah himself, not in a military uniform, not holding a fist in the air, but seated calmly reading a book, just like he had been that day at the park. Children ran past the statue, barely understanding its meaning yet. Teens took pictures beside it for school projects. And adults who once walked past Elijah, without seeing him, now came to Carter Square to remember, reflect, and try to be better. Across the street stood the Carter Education and Justice Center, an initiative founded by Elijah's daughter, Janine, with support from the local council. It offered programs on civic education, racial bias training, legal aid for the underserved, and youth mentoring. Kyle Branson, the very officer who once humiliated Elijah, volunteered weekly. He didn't speak much. He didn't pose for photos. He just showed up. Quietly, consistently. One rainy afternoon, a group of middle schoolers gathered in the center's main hall for a special event. Elijah, now slower in his steps but sharp as ever, had agreed to speak to the kids, something he did less frequently these days. He stepped onto the modest stage, wearing a navy sweater and a smile. The kids clapped softly, unsure what to expect. Elijah began. When I was your age, I never imagined a place like this. A room full of young people being taught how to lead, how to fight for justice without hurting anyone. You all are already doing better than we ever did. A boy raised his hand. Is it true a cop tried to arrest you for sitting in a park? Elijah nodded. Yes, son. He did. Another voice chimed in. Were you scared? Elijah paused. I wasn't scared of the man. I was scared of what might happen after. Scared that no one would believe me. That's what fear does. It grows when people don't listen. A girl asked softly, what happened to the cop? He changed, Elijah said honestly. Not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. That's the part people forget. Real change can't be made through pressure alone. It has to come from within. The room grew quiet. These were young minds, but they understood. They felt the weight of his words, even if they didn't have the vocabulary yet. Elijah ended with what had become his signature phrase. Don't wait until it's on camera. Do the right thing, even when no one's watching. The kids repeated it back to him. Later, as the kids left, one of the teachers approached Elijah. You still change lives, Mr. Carter. Elijah smiled. That's all I ever wanted. Back at home, Janine watched her father carefully. His steps were slower now. Sometimes he'd forget where he put things. Maya, now in college studying social justice, visited every weekend to sit beside her grandfather and listen to his stories, not just the ones from the headlines, but the quiet ones, how he met her grandmother, how he taught himself calculus in the military, how he learned to forgive. One weekend, as Maya sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old scrapbook, she paused on a photo of Elijah in his military uniform. He looked strong, focused, unbreakable. "Grandpa," she said, "do you ever regret staying quiet for so long?" Elijah looked up from his tea. "No," he said. "I needed time to learn when to speak and when to listen. But I don't regret being quiet. I regret that people didn't ask me to speak sooner." Maya nodded. "Well, they're listening now." Elijah reached across the table and held her hand. "Make sure they keep listening. Your generation, you've got the power now. Use it better than we did." One evening, Middleton High School announced it would rename its library after Elijah. The Elijah Carter Freedom Library would feature books on civil rights, Black history, constitutional law, and a new section curated by local students. At the dedication ceremony, Janine gave the speech. "My father taught me that justice doesn't always come in loud moments. Sometimes it comes from a quiet man refusing to move, refusing to be erased." The crowd stood in silence as Elijah, helped to the stage by Maya, cut the ribbon. Tears filled the eyes of strangers, teachers, police officers, and city leaders alike. Elijah didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. His life had already said everything that needed to be said. As time went on, Elijah's health declined, but his spirit never did. Even in his final days, he sat on his porch, a blanket across his knees, nodding to neighbors, always ready with a kind word. When he passed, the entire town of Middleton held a candlelight vigil in Carter Square. People flew in from other cities just to be there. Kyle Branson, still humble, still changed, stood silently in the crowd, a candle in hand. They didn't mourn just the man. They mourned what he represented, and they promised to carry it forward. At the end of the ceremony, Maya stepped up to speak. She stood where her grandfather once stood, not as a child, not as a listener, but as a voice. "My grandfather didn't fight for attention. He fought for dignity. And now it's our turn to fight for truth, for justice, for each other. Not because it's trending, but because it's right." And with that, the flame was passed, not extinguished, but ignited in thousands of hearts. Elijah Carter's legacy would live on, not in monuments or plaques, but in every young person who stood up when it was easier to sit down, in every officer who chose understanding over assumption, in every quiet act of courage, every unrecorded moment of justice. Because the most powerful stories are the ones that never end.